a light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek, and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days and goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to one of the oldest and most beautiful cemeteries in the United States. Because of the tremendous success of our last show, we are again proud to present the annual Clinton Grove Cemetery Walk. This year, our esteemed host, Dr. Philip Groh, noted historian and educator, is going to tell us all new and interesting stories about some of the most fascinating residents of Clinton Grove Cemetery. Today, Dr. Groh is entertaining some fifth graders from the Chippewa Valley School District. As in any other cemetery, there are no reruns here, folks. Now let's join Dr. Groh.
By the way, we have a real nice couple Indian names that I wish we would use. You know, this river that sits over here, Clinton, that's named for two governors in New York State. But it does have an Indian name and has a pretty Indian name. In fact, it means the pretty river. It's called the Nottawassippi. There is another Nottawassippi River in Michigan over near Marshall. But ours, I wish once in a while, I keep saying to the scouts, you know, scouting always uses Indian names. Why don't we go back and use our original Indian name of the Nottawassippi Valley Council rather than the Chippewa Valley Council? Well, you know, lead balloon. I think you'll be happy to know that you don't have to use the original Chippewa name for your address. It runs about that long. Pagawagawenda Moanaki. Pagawagawenda Moanaki. Doesn't that sound nice? It would take up the whole front of the envelope. It means the battleground of the Indians, because the Wyandot, the League of the Chippewas, Ottawas, and Potawatomis, would meet the other Indians that would try to invade and fight here because it was flat land. So if the Delawares tried to invade from Ohio, or the Senecas, who were always the warriors of the Iroquois, they came around Lake Erie and would fight with the Wyandot, or some of the others from the west might try to invade. And so this was the battleground of the warriors right here. Now Charles Dowell, was the person, we were talking history. We're going to talk about things that happened. We're going to look at some pretty markers today. But we're talking about things that happened in this area that were important. Important not just to this area, but to the country. How many know where a Kmart is? I would think so. How many remember that before it was Kmart, it was Kresge? And there are some of us who lived during the Depression and know that Kresge sold china for a nickel a cup and a dime for a plate. because during the Depression, and you ask your grandparents about the Depression, because it was a bad time for a lot of families in this country when very many people had no money. And they'd go to Kresge's because they could buy china, cups and saucers and tableware very cheap. And all that, cheaply, I should speak English, and all those dishes were made here in Mount Clemens. And Charlie Dowell was the man who knew how to make pottery, and he was the manager of the Mount Clemens Pottery, which went out of business a few years ago. More and more people now use plastic, don't you? They use other kinds of materials for dishes. We don't use the old-fashioned dishes that much. But Charlie Dowell and his wife are down this corridor, and you can't miss it because it's spelled D-O-L-L. We're going to go outside. Just step down beyond to where the bushes end and wait there. I'm going to shut off the lights and all these names here, over there is Dickinson and Lee. Joshua Dickinson was the first mayor of Mount Clemens. His son-in-law was George Crocker, who's buried over by the lilac bushes. He was the second mayor of Mount Clemens. Lee was one of the girls. Canfield was another of the girls. And then there were the stepchildren of Christian Clemens and his wife. This person, W. Castle Keith, is listed as a Dutch artist. You can tell he was an artist from the picture on the marker. He studied in Europe and lived most of his time in Europe. He died in Europe. His wife came back in 1927, and then she returned to Holland to live. And in 1940, when the war was starting, the Second World War, and the Germans moved into Holland, she disappeared. And we have no idea whatever happened to her. It's one of those stories. We are very troubled by stories where we don't get answers. We always feel we should be able to find everybody and know what happened. But things happen in life, and you don't always know. And that troubles a lot of people, the not knowing. Whatever happened to so-and-so? And I'd like to get back and work with the unknown youth, because that was a somebody who lived and died in this area, and we still don't know who the young person was. Let's go over this way. The Canfield family is one of the families that descends from Christian Clemens through his daughter. This is one of the monuments that is unusual in the cemetery. That would have been a very difficult thing to do, to get the roundness on the granite. It's because of Clinton Groves having distinctive monuments like this that the state of Michigan has placed a historic marker here at the entrance of Clinton Grove Cemetery. There are many other interesting markers, and we're going to show some of them as we walk through the grounds.
It's Mrs. Banana. Where's Mr. Banana? It's Chiquita.
One of the organizations that was in existence earlier in this century was Woodmen of the World. One of the members was John Petrie, whose tree stump is here. And two members of that organization have very interesting markers here, or monuments in Clinton Grove. This one looks like a tree stump. This was the marker for John Petrie. We will now go over and look at the one that looks like a tree itself. A distinctive monument of a member of the Woodsmen of the World is that of Mr. McDean. As you can see, it is the depiction of a tree trunk. There are logs behind and very elaborate ornamentation.
Why did they use a tree? Nobody knows.
They were the woodsmen of the world. They obviously had an interest because the other one is a tree trunk. The symbol here has a tree, cut down tree. I have to check the Latin. Dum tacet clamet. Must be the grandfather. Well, no, we have about 5 generations here. Adolf is 1844, and then there's the next generation that would have been 1870s. That would be the second generation. There should be a third, and then this would be 4th, and he'd be 5th, maybe. See, 1941, he was born 1965, 67. So 41 to 67 is 26. I'm sure that's father and son. One of the distinctive markers here at Clinton Grove Cemetery is this one for Ernst Jacob Oldie, who was only about 25 years old when he passed away in 1992. I don't know the story. He was obviously a young man, born in 1967, 25 years old, about when he passed away. And the family must have chosen to have this to memorialize him and his best friend, his dog. One of the special stories here at Clinton Grove for me, a very sad story, is that of Paula Marie D'Andretta. She was a high school senior, very talented at Sterling Heights High School, graduated in the class of 1988. It was a very special day because the graduation was at the Palace, and they had to have it in the morning because the Pistons were in the playoffs and had to practice in the afternoon. So the family was very excited about many things and very happy for Paula's achievements. The next day, she went for a ride with a friend, and through the tragedy of an accident, she lost her life. But the family wanted her in a beautiful place and came here to Mount Clemens Clinton Grove Cemetery and put up this monument, including on it part of a poem that she had written in her high school literature class. And it's a good thing to remember because it's very true. It will never be again, this moment. Hold it carefully.
Banner.
Now there are stories, lots of stories here at Clinton Grove. Some funny, some not so funny, some rather sad. Some have lessons to them. Some of the lessons you know because you've heard them on TV, you've heard them from your parents, you've heard them from your teachers. If you were out riding a bicycle at night, what are some of the rules?
Wear bright clothes.
Bright or, well, reflective it could be today. We used to say wear white clothes. What about the bicycle? What do you? Yeah. Well, how should you fix up your bicycle for night riding?
What about one of those reflectors?
Reflectors, yeah, and a light. Well, now this is a sad story because the young man was not wearing white. He didn't have any reflectors on his bicycle that we know of, or a light. I'm sure the driver of the car would have seen him. But we're talking about 1929. But there's some strange things about this. This was 4th of July. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The young man was riding his bike over on Van Dyke between 16 and 15 Mile Road, Beach Highway and 15 Mile Road. Nobody knows why he was out at that time. But a car going the other way pulled out and didn't see him until too late, and he was killed. For several weeks, the newspapers had articles in them about this young man, and the coroner put all the information out that he could. He was about 15 or 16. He was blonde, blue-eyed, but no one came and asked questions. Is that my son? Or is that my nephew? Now, a couple curious things. He was wearing a three-piece suit. So I realize even the adults today don't often wear three-piece suits, a jacket and a vest and pants. But he was. Another thing that was strange, inside his clothing, there were no labels. You know, your clothes all have labels in somehow. Why there were no labels, we don't know. Underneath his clothes, he was wearing a bathing suit. Well, it couldn't have been a suicide. He wouldn't have known the car was coming. Although, that's an interesting idea. But this point still is, nobody read about it in the paper and said, oh, I know who that is. And even today, 67 years later, we still don't know his name. Now, we had a walk back in the 80s, and I had some Boy Scouts helping out. And one of the scouts said, oh, I can kind of relate to that because he had been on the soccer team at Mount Clemens High, and he was going home just wearing his sweats on his bike, and somebody came up over the curb and knocked him down, and he broke his leg. But he thought to himself, I didn't have any ID on me. And so for his Eagle project, for scouting, he collected something like 10,000 pounds of paper. And that was converted to cash, and that was put in here. And John, I did find the article. It was in the Macomb Daily, November 18th, 1985. And in that, at that time, we dedicated this, and the gentleman who was our interim pastor at Zion Church came and led the memorial service, and afterwards we all went up to the office building and had cocoa and cookies. So he was memorialized, and we remember him, but we still don't know who he was. There are other stories here that have lessons, like the 5 children whose mother went out to do Christmas shopping, and when she came home, she found all the children dead because there was smoke and fire. That's a sad story. And then there's another story. There are all kinds of stories. But now I think is the time that you need to do your work. I hope you find a sunny place that has a little bit of warmth, And you go, and I'm going to go over and see my friend there who's just driving in.
Okay, what do we need?
One of the important matters noted by the state for giving Clinton Grove a historical marker was the fact that there are so many interesting monuments and markers in its grounds. This one is fairly new, put up by the Calm family in memory of the parents. The creator of the monument was a member of the family who is an artist, and it adds another beautiful monument for people to admire and also to remember the family. During the heyday of Mount Clemens, when the mineral baths were popular and well attended, people from all over the world came for treatments. Of course, there had to be people here who did the treatments. F. Howard Miller, who was born in 1878 and died in 1930, was actually a physician trained in Scotland. But he came to be a physician in attendance with many of the patients here at the bathhouses. However, as he was a child, when he was a child, he learned to be a ventriloquist. When he came to America to practice his medicine, he found that his hobby would bring him greater monetary returns than the practice of medicine. He was known from Maine to California. He staged benefit shows for invalids. He frequently played the role of Santa Claus at the local Presbyterian church. He appeared at the Macomb Theater and the local high school and did radio broadcasts. During his early years in the city, he worked with young boys and taught a class of boys at the Presbyterian Sunday School. This class was known as the Pioneers. He was a composer of song, and during the First World War, he wrote a song entitled "Somewhere in France is Daddy," which became a big hit that combined martial music, sentiment, and patriotism. His nickname as a ventriloquist was the Great Howard. When his funeral services were held, his dummies, Scotty and Jimmy, were resting in their prop box at home. One of the businessmen in Mount Clemens was Robert Vickery. Many people will remember his various involvements in the city, and also the fact that out in Memphis he had a farm where he raised Percheron horses. This was a fond thing for him. He went into hospital in Detroit for some physical exams and surprised everyone, surprised himself too, I'm sure, by passing away on Valentine's Day, 1988. The family called me, since I was involved with the front office of Clinton Grove at the time, and we helped to help the family find this place to place Bob Vickery, and also to make the monument. I won't forget that funeral for a long time. There were 137 cars in the procession. It took over an hour to come here from the Greek Orthodox Cathedral down at the south end of St. Clair Shores, where it meets Grosse Pointe. And as the funeral procession came in, Big Bill, the Percheron horse, led the procession through the cemetery and over to the mausoleum for the final services. When the family chose a monument for Bob and the family, they specified that they wanted a Percheron horse on the monument and also the Greek cross. I was happy to help them with their dreams. There are always tragedies in family life, and this is one that Mr. and Mrs. Winkleman will always remember. On December 22nd, 1945, their 5 children were suffocated by smoke inhalation from a home fire. They ranged in age from 18 months to 17 years. They are all buried here, the 2 youngest in one grave. As I heard the story, Mother went out to do some last-minute Christmas shopping, leaving the oldest child in charge, but somehow the fire broke out and all the children were killed. These are lessons that I hope young people will take in terms of fire safety, and parents will be more responsible for in terms of leaving their children alone at home. I know Mr. and Mrs. Winkleman have suffered over the years from this tragedy. Looking towards the mausoleum in the front of the cemetery, you're looking over Section D primarily, which was once called the Potter's Field. There are 5 rows, adults, children, adults, children, adults, who are buried in sequence of death in single graves. Many of them are not marked. Many of them contain the remains of people who were living at the old Macomb County farm, which turned into the Department of Social Services in this century. The area of children's burials continues in this section right here, and at the other end of Section J, where the Winkleman children are buried. We are going to turn our thoughts now to a very sad story, and hopefully it will be a lesson in tolerance for those who are listening and viewing today. Here is the marker for Hattie Fletcher. The secretary several years ago here at Clinton Grove Cemetery was so struck by the story that she arranged for the placing of the marker for Hattie Fletcher. Briefly, Hattie Fletcher was a 17-year-old girl who died March 3rd, 1932. She suffered a physical condition which made her toss and writhe about in bed at night. I believe today the doctors have names for this, and I know there have been recent programs on television about this sleep disorder. She was undernourished, and her parents beat her every time she had a seizure because they did not understand her condition. As a result, the neighbors called the authorities. The parents were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. And following that, Hattie died of her injuries. There were many people in the community who helped The sheriff's wife, Mrs. Wiley Wilkinson, presented a dress to the undertaker for the funeral. The floral pieces were donated by Carlos Wittenmeyer, whose wife had been buried the day before here in Clinton Grove. Hundreds visited the Hubbard Funeral Home in downtown Mount Clemens, and the pallbearers were chosen arbitrarily from some of the visitors. She was placed here in Clinton Grove, and the pastor of Zion Church at that time, Pastor Wolfman, officiated at her service. We hope that a story like this will remind people to be tolerant of physical conditions, to seek medical help, and to be charitable to those less fortunate.
Keep them warm.
Last year, in the other tape, we talked about the beginning of the bath industry here in Mount Clemens, about Dor Kellogg and the Frenchman's horse and the discovery of the healing qualities of the mineral waters here in Mount Clemens. Soon after that, many hotels grew up around the bath industry, the largest of which was the Park Hotel. Now, Margaret Schmidt Kiefer came from Buffalo as a patient and visited the hotel and, in time, bought it. The Park Hotel was the grandest hotel of all of them. There were over 200 guest rooms. There was a dining room that sat over 300 guests. Many of the stars of the time came and played theater or played instruments at the Park Hotel. And we remember her, we remember Margaret Kiefer through her daughter Julia and Julia's husband Benjamin MacArthur. Because here in Mount Clemens, next to the YMCA, we have MacArthur Park, which was part of the Park Hotel's gardens. And so the present ties with the past. But the Park Hotel was a wonderful place, and several crowned heads of Europe and names from all over this country came to take the baths here in Mount Clemens. Now we'll go on and talk about some of the entertainers. One of the artists who sang at the Park Hotel and the Mount Clemens Opera House was Sadie Hassan. She had a beautiful voice, and in time, she married the stage manager, Mr. Lockwood. And she is buried in an unmarked grave in this area. A woman that she met also through the theater here in Mount Clemens was an interesting lady who was married 3 times. She started out life as a Dixie Belle. Her name was Lillian Cawthorn. Her first husband was a Confederate serviceman named White. He perished in the Civil War. After the Civil War, she met and married Mr. Hudson, who was in the theater business. He was very successful, and as Mrs. Hudson, she lived a very fine life. But she lost her husband, Mr. Hudson, and as a widow, she was not allowed in those times to take care of her own wealth. If you will think back, you've heard other stories that in the 1890s and early part of this century, women were not considered to be capable of handling their own affairs. So a gentleman came along who was also with the theater, and she married him, thinking that it was a good choice. His name was Hooker, and unfortunately, Mr. Hooker took her. for all her wealth and disappeared. Well, Mrs. Hudson Hooker, not having any income of sorts and being a little bit beyond going on the stage anymore herself, took to renting out her front room of her flat down in the downtown part of Mount Clemens to young people. She rented it by the hour. I think you know what went on. And she was eventually arrested for operating a disorderly house. She was arraigned, and they were planning to bring her to trial, but they didn't. The headlines in the Mount Clemens Monitor that particular day said, "Woman eludes justice by dying." It seems that Lillian Hudson Hooker was a diabetic, and all the trial matters brought an early death to her. She also is buried here next to Mrs. Lockwood in this unmarked area of the cemetery. Most people here in Macomb County know that the County Medical Care Facility is known as the Martha T. Berry Hospital. But a lot of people don't know much about Martha T. Berry herself. Martha Taylor Berry was born up in the Romeo area, and her parents are buried in a country cemetery in that area. She married Dr. Henry Berry, who was a surgeon in the Army during the First World War. After that time, they moved to Mount Clemens, and Dr. Berry became chief of staff at the St. Joseph Hospital. Now, Dr. Berry was a man before his time in some ways. He felt that everybody had a right to good medical care regardless of their family background or their personal wealth. And if he happened to have one man as a patient, or one person as a patient who wasn't too affluent, and another, likely in the same room, who was, he'd say to the person who was a little better off financially, "Well, do you think you're getting good care?" "Oh, yes." "Do you think your roommate here should get the same kind of care?" "Well, yes, I agree. Therefore, I'm going to send his bill to you." And he got away with it. Dr. Berry lost his wife, Martha, in the early 1940s. He was a client of Bert V. Nunley, who we've mentioned before, who's entombed over in the Truffant Mausoleum. And when he came in, he wanted to make arrangements for the disbursement of his estate. Now, it just so happened that a certain Helen Blaffert was Mr. Nunley's secretary, and she sat down with Dr. Berry and wrote it all out. And a few years later, when Dr. Berry passed away, she made sure, along with Mr. Nunley, that all the arrangements were carried out. Now, Dr. Berry left the bulk of his estate to establish a hospital for the indigent, the poor, here in Macomb County. And that is why our county hospital is called the Martha T. Berry Memorial Medical Care Facility. But he also left $1,000 to every one of the churches in the Mount Clemens area. Now, the question came up, did he mean the city of Mount Clemens or the old postal area of Mount Clemens? Well, Helen Blaffert decided it should be every church in the postal area. So all the churches that were then existing out in Clinton Township or Macomb Township or Chesterfield Township or Harrison Township also benefited from Dr. Henry's bequests. How do I know that? Well, Miss Helen Blaffert is now my wife. Every parent has hopes for his child, and certainly Mr. and Mrs. Doobie had great hopes for their daughter, Stephanie. Unfortunately, her life became entangled with drugs and other matters, and she was murdered by some young friends in a very tragic ending. I think the details of her death and the trial of the two young men filled quite a few pages of the Monitor Leader of the Macomb Daily in the last few years. Stephanie is here in Clinton Grove, near her family, her grandmother and her family. And I know she is remembered by her own family. We see the flowers, the angel, and the cross. Other children who did not grow up to adulthood are those that we've mentioned before, like Paula Marie D'Andretta, whose marker's behind us, whose life was cut short in a car accident. And we mentioned the Schroeder children, 3 of whom died in one day because of diphtheria a century ago. What these lives could have done in the world if things had been otherwise. On this lot, we have 3 generations of the Hobson family. The Hobson family was a theatrical family that was known professionally as the Flying Nelsons. They were trapeze artists, worked on the high wire. We have Grandpa and Grandma, we have Mom and Dad, and then we have the grandchildren, the granddaughters. They were very famous in the United States. Rosina, Oneida, and Carmencita followed their father and mother's act, followed their grandparents for many years, and Carmencita is remembered down in Sarasota, Florida, in the Ringling Brothers Museum for her work on the high wire. So in Mount Clemens, they were the Hobsons, but to the world, they were the Flying Nelsons. The Honorable Franz Kuhn is buried behind me here. Franz Kuhn was born here in Mount Clemens in 1872 and showed early that he was a young man of great ability. He graduated from our local high school and then went on to the University of Michigan Law School. While attending U of M, his lifelong interest in politics began. In 1894, he became a circuit court commissioner here in Macomb County, and 4 years later, he became the Mount Clemens prosecuting, or Macomb County prosecuting attorney, and then a judge of probate. In 1909, he was appointed Attorney General of the state of Michigan. 3 years later, in 1912, Governor Osborne elevated him to the Supreme Court of Michigan, where he became Chief Justice at that time when he was 40 years old, one of the youngest in the United States. He is remembered for his genial, warm personality and his great dignity and intelligence. A portrait of the Honorable Judge Kuhn hangs in the Macomb County Courthouse. We have a little involvement with that because my father-in-law, Paul Blaffert, was asked to retouch it at the time it was being, the courthouse was being redone. So at one time, Franz Kuhn's portrait was in my father-in-law's home, getting a little improvement. You might remember from other times that we talked about the Ulrich brothers. Franz Kuhn was a first cousin to the two men who are honored by the large obelisks here in Clinton Grove. The Ulrichs and the Kuhn families, were intermarried several times. Here on the easternmost road of Clinton Grove Cemetery is this huge oak tree. I would imagine that it's several hundred years old and stood here long before it was farm property and long before it was a cemetery. Isn't it a wonderful tree? And in this fall coloring, look at all the browns and russets.
How old do you think this tree is?
I said a couple hundred years old. Yeah. I think it's the largest tree in the cemetery. I'm sure it is. And they kind of planned the road around it. I remember when the road went on both sides of it, but there were just too many accidents. We talked a few minutes ago about Mrs. Hudson Hooker and how she was not able to handle her affairs because at that time women were not allowed to do so. Here is a woman of this century who has been very successful and we wish to remember today. Dr. Mary Margaret Ramey, was a professor at Wayne State University, Highland Park Community College, and several other universities. She was the literary reviewer for the Photographic Society of America Journal and the Publication of Modern Languages Journal. She wrote several books and articles. She was a very successful woman in the academic community. At the time of her death, her husband wished to have a beautiful spot for her and remembered her by having flowers here on the lot. He now has also gone, but in his will, he left money to the cemetery so that there will always be flowers here. You will notice the peace emblem on the marker. That is indicative of her interests during the Vietnam era and the 1960s. Her husband was an immigrant from Lebanon who became successful as an importer and was very, very much in love with his wife. I think this is a lovely expression that they have for each other, and also his expression of care for his brother and nephew, who are also buried here on this lot. One gentleman who has an interesting past and story is Alan Straight. Alan was born just a few months before my dad in the little town of Cattaraugus, New York. In fact, I remember as I was growing up that his aunt and uncle lived across the road from my father's uncle and aunt. Alan Straight went to become a law enforcement officer, and he solved many cases here in Michigan under under Governor Alexander Grossbeck. He was involved in cases here in the state that had to do with a bank holdup. There was a religious group called the House of David, and he was involved at that time with the investigation of that group, with several murders. And then he became the head of the state police after he was police chief here in Mount Clemens. Following that, he became a member of the U.S. Secret Service. While in the Secret Service, he happened to be one of the people placed on the White House detail as a bodyguard to President Harding. And while he was serving in that capacity, he was in the first group of Secret Service agents that went to pick up President Coolidge and bring him to Washington upon the death of President Harding. He then became involved with the prosecution associated with Eliot Ness and others of prohibition violators. And he was working here in Mount Clemens. There is a question whether he might also have been taking money from the underworld, because I had a story once from somebody who said she knew that whenever there was about to be a raid on a speakeasy, a phone call came first from Allen Straight. And then the raid would arrive of the feds, and everybody was drinking tea. So maybe that was true, maybe that wasn't. In any case, after serving here in so many years in law enforcement, one night in February of 1937, he went upstairs, and the two women who were rooming in the house and his wife heard a gunshot. And when they went to investigate, they found that he had killed himself. The exact reason, we shall never know. Now, his wife, Alice Norton Straight, was the sister of the lady who married Mr. Price and were very much involved in the Macomb Daily and the newspapers here in the area. Allen Straight's father was also a newspaperman and followed Frank Nellis as editor of the old Mount Clemens Monitor. So many of these stories are interwoven, and the source for a lot of the information is right here in Clinton Grove. I mentioned that the editor of the Mount Clemens Monitor, Frank Nellis, had a way with words. This appeared in the Mount Clemens Monitor January 11th, 1894, and I'm reading it exactly as it is in the newspaper. The thrilling case of Miss Mary Schrader. The thrilling case of Miss Mary Schrader of Macomb, a damsel of 50 summers who brought suit against Peter Steffens of Lenox, a Lothario of 65 beautiful years, came on next. Miss Mary sued the irresistible deceiver for $5,000 for breach of promise. Henry Orens of Detroit and Martin Crocker appeared for Miss Mary, while O.C. Lungerhausen assumed the invidious task of defending hoary-headed duplicity. A jury was secured without difficulty, and then, in a voice trembling with emotion, Mr. Orens opened for the prosecution. As he told how his client had been hornswoggled in the matter of her budding affections, several women in the audience burst into such multitudinous tears that the water meter in the basement blew up with a loud report. The honorable judge was evidently in the throes of almost uncontrollable emotion, while strong men went out into the hallways and snorted in agonies of grief. Miss Mary testified that she had become engaged to Peter in September of 1892. He asked her if she didn't want him for her man, and she said she did, providing the proposition was agreeable to her daughter. It was shown that Peter got out a license. Then, base wretch, he flew the track. There was no defense, and so the jury gave Miss Mary $125. This is a job lot figure to place on a trusting damsel's affections, but the moral effect of the judgment will not be inconsiderable. Unscrupulous dudes must not be permitted to strike careless notes on the heartstrings of innocence. In the apposite language of Mr. Guppy, there are chords. Now that was what Mr. Nellis wrote in the Monitor. This is what appeared the same day in the Mount Clemens Press. Mary Schrader versus Peter Steffens, judgment $125 in courts, costs were given complainant, and a motion was denied for new trial. This case was for breach of promise, and the parties, being 50 years and 65 years of age respectively, brought considerable amusement. Both are from Macomb. We have enjoyed researching and finding out. Many of the stories are interesting, and I wish there were time to share them all with the viewers here of Channel 5. From time to time, we hope we can expand on these shows and add other segments of the history of the community, working from Clinton Grove Cemetery's records and heritage. Thank you for viewing. If you have any questions or want any information, please contact me or the staff here at Clinton Grove Cemetery.
Thank you, Dr. Groh. Established in 1855, the Clinton Grove Cemetery exhibits an exquisite array of funerary art in a wooded landscape. This combination of nature and monuments reflects the rural cemetery movement of the 19th century, which popularized park-like pastoral planned landscapes in both rural and urban settings. The grounds include a caretaker's house built around 1885 and a Tudor office and chapel building designed by Mount Clemens architect Theophilus Van Dam, which dates from 1914. Many business and political leaders are interred here, as well as veterans of American military conflicts from the Revolutionary War through the Vietnam War. 6,000 burials date from the 19th century. Clinton Grove Cemetery is listed in the National Register of Historic Places.